Indeed, what we have been hearing since this morning in this passionate and passionating talks, mainly related to quite innovative food, we'll all agree on that. Not all of them, but most of them, and certainly the cell-based products, do qualify indeed as a novel food, which you just quoted. Because...
And those are forbidden, right?
Don't go too fast.
Okay,
Don't
not
go
too fast. Okay.
They're actually subject to a specific legal framework, let's say. So they are forbidden until they are authorized, which makes sense. But it's actually novel foods, to put it very simply, are a very specific category of foods in the sense that foods in principle are not subject to a prior authorization process before they can be placed on the market. It's the responsibility of food business operators placing food on the market to ensure that the food they sell, they offer to consumers is safe. And there is no prior control, there is no pre-market approval process in place. But that's not true for novel foods. And novel foods are actually a category of foods that are foods not consumed before a deadline, a set date, a date set by European regulations, and that date is very arbitrary. It's 15th of May 1997, a date set in a regulation of 1997. That date is still valid today, even though the legal framework has quite significantly evolved very recently, with a new novel food regulation entering into force in January this year. And basically, novel food is not only food that has not been consumed before the 15th of May 1997 in Europe, but it also needs to respond to another criterion, which is to be part of one of 10 categories defined under the regulation. I will not go through all 10 categories, okay. But one of those categories is cell culture-based products, be it plant cells, meat cells, animal cells, all products derived or produced from such cell cultures will qualify generally as novel foods, unless you can show that such food was consumed to a significant degree in Europe before 1997, but I think that's quite a stretch.
Okay. No, but it's interesting. So all these things we've been discussing now, which is like perhaps not plant-based, because those are not novel foods, right? That's correct.
Plant-based products might be novel food if they are derived from plants that were not consumed before 1997 or produced through new growing or breeding technologies not used before that date. But generally speaking, yes, it looks like the plant-based products we've been discussing will not qualify as novel food, although certain ingredients in those products might qualify as such.
Like heme protein, for instance, in the Impossible Burger.
Exactly, that one rang a bell.
Okay, so it's really interesting. So what we're facing now is, of course, a situation where the food sector needs to come up with new products. Cell-based, we've heard about that. We've heard about the plant-based alternatives. We even heard about the air-based alternatives, right? And so all these are really strictly forbidden in Europe until they've been approved, right?
That's correct. So
is that a hassle to approve things?
It's quite a process. I'm not going to hide that. But it's a process that's been improved recently. I just mentioned that there is a new regulation in place. Mm-hmm. That regulation has a big advantage over the previous regulation that was in place, is that it sets deadlines for the authorities to make decisions on the applications that are made. And also, and that's another advantage of the new regulation, or at least quite a change in comparison to the previous regulation, the novel food regulation now provides for a centralized assessment, which means that all applications for authorizations of novel food will be filed with the European Commission and will be examined by EFSA.
Okay, so when Sheer and her buddies at Supermeat has come up with the first chicken or the first mammoth beef, I don't know, they will go to the European Union, somewhere in Brussels, I suppose, and have it approved. It takes a year or 2 years, or
it might take a little bit more than that.
Okay, it takes a couple of years. Okay.
Yes. What will be required essentially to be included in what is called the Union list of novel food? Applicants will need to demonstrate that their food is safe. That's quite basic, but it means that substantial data will have to be provided. We understand that. Some data is missing at the moment. There is still being generated. It will also need to be shown that the food that will be proposed to consumers is not misleading to those consumers as regards their characteristics, so the proper communication about the characteristics of the food, how it's made, what it's made of. But also, and that might be a challenge as well, the food will only be authorized if it's not nutritionally disadvantageous as compared to a food it's supposed to replace. And that's a debate which I think will still know interesting developments in the coming years.
Okay, lovely. So there's still going to be a hassle to get these new food products to the market. Well, will you have a patent then for a while, or what is?
So the novel food regulation does not deal with IP. It's completely separated from intellectual property, but it does provide for a system of regulatory data protection. And that's also maybe a challenge, because I hear that innovation here is on a collaborative basis. There is a lot of exchange of information among the stakeholders. However, of course, from a commercial perspective, it's also something to think of quite in time. How to protect your proprietary data, how to make sure you protect your investments in research. And the novel food regulation in that respect provides for a data protection regime that allows applicants to obtain data exclusivity for a period of 5 years of certain data in their dossier. Besides that data protection regime, which is quite strict, the requirements are quite strict and quite difficult to meet, certainly on the basis of the case law of the Commission on the subject in respect of health claims, if anyone is aware of that. But the data protection regime in the novel foods regulation was somehow taken over from the health claims regulation. And there, the case law or the interpretation of the Commission as to what is proprietary data eligible for data protection is quite strict, in the sense that, to make it simple, peer-reviewed data would not be eligible for protection.
I think this is all really interesting. Somehow, of course, it brings forward the question of, okay, so everything that was produced before 15th of May 1997 is okay. Doesn't matter how bad or shitty the product is. That's okay. Every good product that's been produced after that is not okay, right? Or will this also be followed up then with some sort of a, you have to reassess the current products in the market?
Well, no. The current products are on the market.
They're safe.
They have to be safe. So there is a duty of the operators.
Well, they're safe from the legal perspective, not from the healthcare perspective, perhaps. I don't know.
I see your point. Indeed, that's another debate, and the novel food regulation does not deal with that. However, of course, you can't make certain claims in respect of products that are harmful to health. This is limited. There are different requirements applicable when you want to advertise the properties of a food, even though in the absence of nutrient profiles, even unsafe food can be advertised as interesting or at least beneficial for health. So, of course, but that's an issue that is not dealt with the novel food regulation, even though when a novel food is assessed, as I said, its nutritional value in itself will also be assessed, and it will not be approvable if the food is nutritionally disadvantageous as compared to the food it's supposed to replace.
Okay, but then another question that brings to mind. So Sheer and her friends at Supermeat, for instance, they will then grow meat in tanks. It will start in Israel, right? And then, but their aim is to industrialize this, so license the system. So there will be tanks in Sweden and the US and Brussels and everywhere. But they will be controlled from Israel, those tanks. So where is the food then grown?
Well, the place where the food is grown is, of course, of utmost importance, but to be brought to the European market, it will need to meet European standards.
Yeah.
And so wherever it's produced, if it's imported for distribution and sale in Europe, it will have to meet those standards, and the novel food regulation standards and requirements will need to be met whenever you want to place these products on this market.
Okay, I just think it's kind of an interesting thing where you blur the borders between what's the product and what's the service levels around it, and of course producing things in Europe but steering it from somewhere else is, of course, makes it possible for you to meddle with it. I wouldn't ever claim that Sheer and her friends would do that, but isn't that kind of an interesting perspective for a lawyer?
To have the business operated from outside Europe. Well, yes, but from a strict regulatory perspective, what I will be looking at is who will be the food business operator responsible on the EU market.
Yep.
But of course, I mean, the setup of business and the architecture that can be put in place there is, of course, of utmost interest. But that's again not dealt with the regulatory framework per se.
Interesting. And of course, when you start thinking about the novel foods products like the Impossible Burgers, we all think it's a product, but really it's a recipe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you protect those recipes?
Well, that's again a complicated one. It's an intellectual property question. Recipes per se, well, I mean, cooking recipes are not protectable as such, generally speaking. Now, processes, certain designs can be protected. You can also patent your production process, but the recipe itself will probably much more be among the business secrets, trade secrets, that also are protected by a specific framework.
Okay, so it's more like the Coca-Cola recipe. So there is absolutely then a possibility for people to go out and understand what the Impossible Burger looks like, try to replicate and mimic that without really infringing on their IP. Potentially. It's a really interesting question, right?
Another point that makes me think of it is that under the novel food regulation, all authorizations will be generic, which means that as soon as one product, let's say one platform, is authorized, in principle, other operators can also come on the market, just with Me Too products, provided these products meet, of course, the requirements that have been approved as part of the novel food application process. But that's where regulatory data protection enters into play and will be quite of crucial importance. If you don't want to have one company make all the efforts for bringing a new technology to market, and having all other companies use all these efforts without having to fight anything, that will raise interesting questions as well.
I think it's a dynamic question there, because then you have a couple of years before someone can really step in on your turf, which means that if you bring a new product to the market and you get it approved, then you really have to race with it, because you have 5 years before someone else can step in.
That's correct, and that's quite a short period of time. Yes, okay. That's right.
Interesting. That means that if you want to bring a new food product to the market, you also need to be prepared to scale it rapidly. I think that's a good incentive, however, so that we make sure that we get these companies well financed, etc. Okay, thank you so much, Nikolas. You will be here, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions thrown at you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.